This is the story of a man who had it all. A congressman who said he was fighting for the people of New Orleans, but was playing a different game behind the scenes. William Jefferson, a name once spoken with respect, became a symbol of greed when the FBI made a shocking discovery: $90,000 stashed in his freezer. And that was just the start. We're talking bribes, secret deals overseas, and a fall from grace that hit hard. This wasn't just any scandal. This was a full-blown betrayal. So how did it go so wrong? Let's dig in and see how one of Louisiana's own ended up in the middle of a corruption case that rocked the nation.
When power and greed mix, yeah, the truth get blurred. Got promises being made where the words get slurred. Forging deals in the dark, moving like a politician till the feds came a sniffing. Now he asking for forgiveness. Bribes in his pocket, legislation being sued. He keep cash in the freezer, 90K, that's really cool. Back in 91, he had the city on his side. Now he caught up in the case, going on a legal ride. When power and greed mix, yeah, the truth get blurred. When power and greed mix, yeah, the truth get blurred.
Before scandal and disgrace, there was a promise wrapped in ambition and a vision for a better Louisiana. William Jefferson wasn't always the man at the center of a national scandal. He was once seen as a beacon of hope, a figure who carried the dreams and expectations of his community on his shoulders, someone who, from humble beginnings, rose against the odds. William's story started far from the bright lights and bustling streets of New Orleans. Born and raised in the rural farmlands of East Carroll Parish, he came from a family of sharecroppers. Life there was tough, defined by long days in the fields, dirt roads, and the kind of resilience it takes to survive in the Louisiana Delta. For young William, these weren't just passing experiences. They shaped him, gave him grit, and set his gaze on something greater. He dreamed of a future beyond those fields and promised himself he would do whatever it took to get there. Driven by that ambition, he excelled in school and eventually earned a spot at Southern University, a place where he began to see what was possible. But he didn't stop there. With unmatched determination, he went on to study at Harvard Law, a place worlds away from East Carroll Parish. Harvard represented something profound for him, a step into a world he once thought out of reach. Standing there, surrounded by towering ivy-clad walls and bustling classmates from all backgrounds, he knew he was stepping into his own future. Returning to Louisiana in the late 70s, Jefferson was a man with a vision. He looked at New Orleans, a city marked by stark divides between wealth and poverty, and he saw himself as someone who could bridge that gap. He understood the challenges firsthand, and his words resonated with the people. They saw him not as a politician out for himself, but as one of their own. Someone who felt their struggles, shared their dreams, and who, against all odds, had achieved what many couldn't. Rising through the ranks, Jefferson quickly made a name for himself. He began his political career in the Louisiana State Senate, advocating for his community, championing causes that other politicians ignored. He fought for equal access to resources, aimed to improve education, and pushed for economic opportunities in places that had seen little investment. For many in his district, Jefferson was more than a politician. He was a fighter, someone who could turn the tide for their city. In the mid-1980s, he took his ambitions to Washington, winning a seat in the U.S. Congress. His supporters saw him as a symbol of progress, a Louisiana native who had climbed to the highest ranks of American politics. He held the title of congressman with pride, representing New Orleans and pushing forward legislation that he promised would benefit the people who had supported him since the start. But with power comes temptation. As Jefferson's influence grew, so did the challenges of navigating a political world full of shadowy deals and risky decisions. The promises he made, the dreams he held for New Orleans, they began to blur with the allure of wealth and influence. He was now playing a different game, one that demanded more than the ideals he had held close. The whisper started small, barely audible over the usual hum of political talk. At first, it sounded like nothing more than gossip. A congressman with ties to suspicious deals and quiet exchanges. But as the rumors persisted, William Jefferson's name kept surfacing, along with questions about his finances and the links he might be going to line his pockets. It was an international business deal that caught the FBI's attention. Jefferson, a man known for championing minority-owned businesses, had used his influence to broker contracts between American companies and foreign officials in West Africa. But there was a catch, a price tag that, as investigators suspected, went straight to Jefferson himself. He had allegedly been using his position to secure deals for companies in exchange for personal kickbacks. The investigation was cautious at first, quiet and methodical. FBI agents tracked Jefferson's communications, recorded conversations, and sifted through financial records, piecing together what appeared to be a web of deception. Each thread they uncovered led to something bigger, darker, and more calculated than anyone had expected. Then came the raid. In a quiet Washington, D.C. neighborhood, on a warm spring day in 2005, a team of FBI agents moved in on Jefferson's home. They swept through the rooms, looking for any evidence that could tie him to the allegations of bribery and corruption. Papers, files, computers, everything was scrutinized. But it was what they found in the kitchen that sent shockwaves through the investigation, and soon after, the nation. Hidden behind bags of frozen food, wrapped in foil and stashed carefully in his freezer, agents found $90,000 in cash. Neatly bundled and carefully preserved, it was a symbol of the life Jefferson had tried to hide, a life that was now laid bare for all to see. The media seized on the story. "Cold Cash Congressman," the headline screamed. News outlets covered every detail, with reporters crowding outside Jefferson's home, cameras capturing every angle of the scandal that was quickly becoming a national sensation. The freezer full of cash became the defining image, a shocking representation of the betrayal felt by those who had once believed in him. For Jefferson's supporters, it was like a punch to the gut. They had seen him as a man of integrity, someone who understood their struggles and had fought for their rights. Now they had to grapple with the reality that he might have used that trust to serve his own interests. The community that once rallied behind him was left with disbelief, anger, and a growing sense of betrayal. But Jefferson didn't go down without a fight. He denied the charges, insisting that the money was meant for legitimate business ventures, not bribes. He claimed he was only trying to create economic opportunities, not profit from them. Yet, as the FBI dug deeper, the evidence piled up. Recorded conversations, financial transfers, testimonies from associates, all of it pointed to a man who had crossed the line from public servant to self-serving deal maker. As the scandal unfolded, the image of William Jefferson transformed. Once seen as a champion of his people, he was now portrayed as a man who had let greed erode his integrity. The cash in the freezer wasn't just money. It was a symbol of broken promises, of a man who had strayed from the ideals he once claimed to stand for. In New Orleans and across the country, people watched, stunned, as the story played out. The congressman they had looked up to was now a symbol of corruption. His fall from grace, a stark reminder of how power and ambition could unravel even the most carefully crafted image. And as the evidence continued to mount, Jefferson's life and career unraveled right before the public's eyes. The courtroom was packed, filled with reporters, spectators, and a few loyal supporters who had stood by Jefferson despite the mounting evidence. Outside, cameras flashed and reporters jostled for position, eager to capture the face of the congressman who had once stood in as a symbol of progress, now facing one of the most sensational trials in recent political history. As he took his seat, William Jefferson was no longer the confident congressman who had commanded the respect of his district. He looked tired, worn down by the months of relentless investigation, wiretaps, and evidence that seemed to strip away any semblance of innocence. The trial was set to be brutal. The prosecution had a mountain of evidence, and they were ready to lay it out piece by piece. The opening statement set the tone. The prosecution painted Jefferson as a man who had used his position for personal gain, a politician who had betrayed the very people who had put their trust in him. They described him as someone who wasn't just involved in backdoor deals but actively orchestrated them, manipulating his influence for bribes and business deals that would pad his bank account. The star witness took the stand, a businesswoman who had worked closely with Jefferson and eventually cooperated with the FBI. She detailed the bribes, the promises, and the chilling precision with which Jefferson had coordinated his deals. Her testimony was damning, painting a vivid picture of a man driven by greed, willing to sacrifice his integrity for a payout. Then came the tapes. The prosecution played recordings of Jefferson discussing his plans in cold, methodical detail, mapping out how he would use his congressional influence to secure contracts in Africa. His voice, once filled with charisma and conviction, now sounded calculating and distant. Each recording pulled the jury deeper into the web of deception he had spun, showing a man who had lost sight of his role as a public servant. Throughout the trial, Jefferson's defense maintained his innocence, arguing that the money was for legitimate business ventures, not bribes. They claimed he was simply trying to bring economic opportunities to American companies and had not broken any laws in the process. But as the prosecution unveiled more evidence, emails, financial records, and witness testimonies, his defense grew weaker. The jury watched as piece by piece, the once respected congressman's life unraveled in front of them. As the trial wore on, the weight of the evidence became undeniable. Each new detail painted Jefferson in a darker light. Each witness statement chipped away at the image of the man who had once been a symbol of hope for his community. The people who had supported him, who had looked up to him as one of their own, now saw a different side, a side they hadn't wanted to believe existed. Finally, after weeks of testimony, arguments, and damning revelations, the jury reached a verdict. William Jefferson, the congressman who had once stood for change, was found guilty on multiple counts, including bribery, racketeering, and money laundering. The courtroom fell silent as the reality set in. The man who had promised to uplift his community was now destined for a different path, one that led far from the halls of Congress and into a prison cell. For New Orleans, it was a painful moment. The trial had exposed more than just the crimes of one man. It had laid bare the vulnerability of a city that had placed its faith in a flawed leader. As Jefferson was led away, the promises he'd made, the speeches he'd given, all faded into the background. In that moment, he wasn't the congressman they had believed in. He was simply another man who had fallen victim to his own ambition. The final chapter in William Jefferson's political saga came to a close in a courtroom filled with reporters, former supporters, and a few loyal family members. As the judge read the sentence, the weight of Jefferson's actions became painfully clear. For multiple counts of bribery, racketeering, and money laundering, he was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever imposed on a former member of Congress for corruption at the time. The man who had promised to bring pride and change to New Orleans was now facing over a decade behind bars. Outside the courthouse, reactions were mixed. Reporters swarmed to capture every emotion, every strained face, while Jefferson's family exited in somber silence. Some supporters, despite the overwhelming evidence, remained in disbelief, struggling to reconcile the man they once believed in with the one convicted before them. For the rest of the community, however, Jefferson's sentencing was an undeniable betrayal, a painful end to what had once been a hopeful story of resilience and ambition. The ripple effect of Jefferson's fall spread quickly through New Orleans. His district, which had placed so much trust in him, was left to pick up the pieces. For community leaders who had touted him as a role model, it was a challenge to explain his actions to young people who had admired him. His name, once associated with upliftment and opportunity, now became a symbol of broken promises and lost potential. Politically, Jefferson's downfall created a void. New candidates rose to fill his place, many campaigning on platforms of integrity, promising a different kind of leadership. Yet his shadow loomed large, and constituents were slower to trust. His betrayal left a lasting scar, leaving many wary of placing their faith in politicians who seemed too good to be true. Meanwhile, Jefferson adjusted to life behind bars. Stripped of the influence and power he had wielded for years, he was left to reflect on the decisions that had led him here. The rallies, the campaign speeches, the crowd's cheers, these memories were now eclipsed by the choices that had cost him everything. In the end, Jefferson's legacy was complicated. He would forever be remembered not just as the congressman who rose from humble beginnings, but as the man whose ambition ultimately led him astray. His story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily power can corrupt even those who once rose with the best of intentions. New Orleans, meanwhile, moved on, rebuilding its trust and leadership one careful step at a time.